The air in the kitchen was thick and heavy, not just with the late August humidity, but with everything we hadn't said for the past 6 weeks. The only light came from the open refrigerator, casting a pale, ghostly glow on Isabel's face, making shadows dance in the hollows of her cheeks. She moved without a sound, a phantom in a silk nightgown, and stopped just before me. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild animal trapped in a cage of bone. She raised a hand, her fingers cool and delicate, and pressed her palm flat against my chest, right over the chaos. "Do you feel that, Leo?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the crushing silence. The silence. It's screaming in this house. I could only nod, my throat tight. I could smell the faint scent of jasmine that always clung to her skin, a scent I now associated with sleepless nights and a dangerous burgeoning hope. Her eyes, dark pools of liquid regret, held mine. They weren't the eyes of a stepmother or my father's wife. They were the eyes of a woman who was just as lost as I was. She rose onto her toes, her body leaning into mine, and the space between our lips dwindled to nothing. The scent of wine was on her breath, sweet and forbidden. But to understand the tremor in her hand, to understand the desperation in that almost kiss, you have to go back to the beginning of June, when I first came home from my freshman year of college. I returned to a house that had always felt more like a museum than a home, a sprawling monument to my father's success. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a clipped, "Good to have you back, son," before his phone buzzed, pulling him back into a world of conference calls and closing deals. He left for Zurich the next morning, and then there were 2 of us, me and Isabel. In the beginning, she was just a beautiful, elegant fixture in my father's life, moving through the cavernous rooms with a quiet grace that made the house seem even bigger, even emptier. She was a puzzle I had no interest in solving. I had no idea that by the end of the summer, she would be the only thing I could think about, the one who would teach me everything I ever needed to know about the flawed, fragile anatomy of the human heart. The taxi pulled away from the curb, its sound swallowed immediately by the manicured silence of the neighborhood. I stood for a moment on the blue stone walkway, my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and stared up at the house. It wasn't a home, not in the way my friends from school had homes. It was an architectural statement, a testament to my father's relentless ambition, all clean lines, dark wood, and vast panes of glass that reflected the stoic, unblinking Connecticut sky. It was the house I grew up in, yet every time I returned, I felt like a visitor. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and money. And there she was, emerging from the living room, a silhouette against the bright afternoon light flooding in from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Isabel, my father's wife. She moved with a fluid grace that always seemed at odds with the house's rigid geometry. She wore a simple cream-colored linen dress, but on her, it looked like couture. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose, elegant knot at the nape of her neck, and her smile was polite, practiced, and didn't quite reach her eyes. "Leo, welcome home," she said, her voice soft and melodic. It was the kind of voice you could listen to for hours, yet it always seemed to hold a hint of distance. "Hi, Isabel," I replied, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. I dropped my bag, and the sound of it hitting the marble floor seemed to echo through the cavernous foyer. "How have you been?" "I've been well. We're so glad to have you back. Did you have a good trip?" It was a script we'd performed before. The polite inquiries, the careful distance. In the 3 years since she'd married my father, our relationship had never progressed beyond this gentle, arm's-length courtesy. She was a beautiful, untouchable presence in the periphery of my life, a figurehead in the silent kingdom my father ruled. I was the visiting prince from a foreign land, the land of noisy dorm rooms, cheap pizza, and actual, messy life. Just then, my father appeared at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase. Richard Sterling wasn't a man who walked. He was a man who made an entrance. He was dressed in a crisp, dark suit, even though it was a Saturday afternoon. He descended the stairs, his expensive shoes clicking with an air of authority. "There he is," he boomed, his voice filling the space in a way Isabel's never could. He didn't hug me. He never did. Instead, he clasped my shoulder with a firm, proprietary grip and then shook my hand. Good to see you, son. Finished the year strong? Grades look solid. Yeah, they were fine, I said. Biology was tough, but I pulled through. Good, good, he nodded, already distracted, his gaze sweeping the room as if checking for imperfections. Listen, I'm glad you're here. We'll have dinner tonight, a proper welcome home, before I have to fly out tomorrow morning. My heart sank, a familiar, dull thud of disappointment. Another trip? Zurich, he said, as if the name of the city explained everything. Big merger. Can't be helped. It's only for a couple of weeks. You and Isabel can hold down the fort. He said it with a casual finality that left no room for argument. He looked at Isabel, then a quick, appraising glance. You look lovely, darling. He kissed her cheek, a brief, dry peck that was more of a gesture than an act of affection. She smiled that same placid smile, but I saw something flicker in her eyes for a half second. A tiny, almost imperceptible dimming of the light. Then it was gone. Dinner was exactly as I expected. We sat at the enormous mahogany table in the formal dining room, a room we only used when my father wanted to feel like a king in his castle. The clinking of our silverware on the porcelain plates was the dominant sound. My father talked about interest rates, market projections, and the incompetence of his European counterparts. I tried to chime in with a story about a prank in my dorm, but the words died in the sterile air, feeling trivial and childish. Isabel was the perfect hostess, ensuring my glass was never empty, laughing softly at my father's pronouncements. She was an expert at filling the silences, asking me just enough questions about my classes to maintain the illusion of a normal family conversation. But I watched her. I watched the way she carefully cut her food into tiny pieces, the way her fingers traced the stem of her wine glass, the way her gaze would occasionally drift to the darkened gardens outside the window. She was present, but she was also a million miles away. The next morning, my father was gone before I even woke up. I heard the distant rumble of his town car crunching over the gravel of the driveway, and then a profound silence descended upon the house. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air. The house, which had felt large with him in it, now felt impossibly vast, an empty stage waiting for a play that would never begin. I spent the day in a state of aimless limbo. I unpacked my bags in my room, a space that felt more like a guest suite than the bedroom of a son. The posters on the walls from my high school years seemed like artifacts from another person's life. I wandered through the silent halls, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the polished stone. The whole place was a gallery of my father's taste. Abstract art that was meant to convey emotion, but felt cold and calculated. Sculptures that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. Furniture that looked beautiful but was brutally uncomfortable. Nothing was out of place. There was no clutter, no sign of the messy, chaotic business of living. I found Isabel in the sunroom, a glass-walled space at the back of the house filled with immaculate, exotic-looking orchids. She was sitting in a white wicker chair, a thick novel open in her lap, though she didn't seem to be reading. She was just staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn, her expression unreadable. She looked up as I entered, a little startled, as if she wasn't used to anyone else being in her quiet corner of the world. "Oh, Leo. I didn't hear you," she said. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," I mumbled, feeling like an intruder. "You're not interrupting anything," she said, closing her book. "Just thinking." The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but not exactly comfortable either. It was just empty. Two strangers, bound by a man who was now on the other side of the ocean. The long, quiet, humid summer stretched out before us. I looked at this beautiful woman, this perfect wife, in this perfect house, and I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of alienation. I had no way of knowing that the oppressive silence I felt that day was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the fertile, empty ground where something dangerous and unexpected was about to take root. The first few days of my father's absence were a quiet, awkward ballet. We'd orbit each other in the vast expanse of the house, our paths crossing in the hallways with a polite nod, a murmured good morning. We took our meals at opposite ends of that ridiculously long mahogany table, the silence between us, a third guest, formal and unyielding. The sheer distance felt absurd, like we were two heads of state at a tense diplomatic summit. The turning point, the first crack in the polished veneer of our formality, came on the third morning. I was in the kitchen, fumbling with my father's complicated espresso machine, when she glided in, already dressed in a simple but elegant gray sundress. "That machine has a mind of its own," she said, her voice laced with a surprising hint of amusement. "Richard insists on it, but I think it secretly hates us all." I laughed, a real, unforced laugh, and the sound felt foreign and loud in the quiet room. "I'm starting to think you're right," I admitted, finally managing to produce a sputtering, mediocre shot of espresso. "Can I make you one?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a small nod. "I'd love that. Thank you, Leo." That simple act of sharing a coffee seemed to break a spell. That evening, instead of heading to the mausoleum-like dining room, she gestured towards the small, circular breakfast table tucked into a bay window in the kitchen. "Do you mind if we just eat in here?" she asked. "It feels less ridiculous." I agreed immediately. And so, the kitchen became our sanctuary. The geography of our relationship shifted from acres of polished mahogany to a few feet of warm, worn oak. The conversation started small. We talked about the weather, the overgrown hydrangeas in the garden, my easiest and hardest classes from the past semester. I told her about my roommate, a perpetually messy engineering student from Ohio, and she told me about a stubborn wren that kept trying to build a nest in the dryer vent. It was all trivial, meaningless chatter, but it was the necessary mortar, filling the gaps that had existed between us for 3 years. Slowly, I began to see the woman behind the title of Mrs. Sterling. One afternoon, I found her in the library, another of my father's grand, unused rooms, and saw that the book in her hands wasn't the latest bestseller I'd assumed she'd read, but a collection of poems by Neruda. "I didn't know you read poetry," I said, my surprise evident. She looked up, her finger marking her place. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me, Leo," she said, not unkindly. It was a simple statement of fact, but it felt like an invitation. We discovered we had a shared love for old jazz records, the kind my father dismissed as depressing noise. One evening, she put on a Billie Holiday album, and the smoky, melancholic sound filled the kitchen, weaving around us, pulling us closer without us ever having to move. She swayed gently to the music, her eyes closed, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of the woman she might have been before this house, before my father. The real catalyst, however, was my summer coursework. I was taking an advanced genetics course online to get ahead, and I was drowning in Punnett squares and complex theories of chromosomal inheritance. I'd spread my textbooks and notes across the kitchen table late one night, my brain feeling like a tangled knot of DNA. Isabel came downstairs for a glass of water, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She paused behind me, looking over my shoulder. "Meiosis giving you trouble?" she asked casually. I looked up at her, stunned. "How did you know that?" A soft, genuine smile touched her lips, transforming her entire face. It was different from the polite, public smile I was used to. This one was real, and it was breathtaking. "I was a biology major for 2 years at Barnard," she said, pulling up a chair, "before I switched to music. That night, she sat with me for hours. She didn't just give me the answers. She explained the concepts with a clarity and passion that my professor utterly lacked. She sketched out diagrams on a napkin, her long, graceful fingers making the complexities of cellular division seem simple, even beautiful. I was captivated, not just by her intelligence, but by the proximity of her faint jasmine scent wrapped around me. When she leaned in close to point something out in my textbook, a strand of her dark hair fell across her cheek, and I watched, mesmerized, as she absently tucked it behind her ear. It was such a small, human gesture, and it struck me with the force of a revelation. This perfect, composed woman was real. From that night on, our late-night study sessions became a ritual. It was our excuse, an academically sanctioned reason to be close, to talk for hours after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. And as she explained the intricate systems that governed life, I found myself studying her. I studied the way her brow would furrow in concentration, the light in her eyes when she talked about something she was passionate about. I studied the curve of her neck when she looked down at a page, the delicate bones of her wrist as she held a pen. I found myself watching her hands a lot. They were expressive, elegant, with clean, unpolished nails. They were the hands of a pianist, I realized, hands that knew how to create beauty. I started to notice things I never had before. I noticed the deep, underlying sadness in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking, a fleeting shadow that would pass over her face as she stared out the kitchen window into the darkness. It was a profound loneliness, a quiet ache that I was beginning to recognize because I felt a version of it inside myself. The conversations began to drift away from science. We'd close the textbooks, but we'd keep talking. The kitchen island, our shared confessional booth. She asked me about my future, what I wanted to do with my life, and she listened, truly listened in a way my father never had. I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone, about my fear of ending up in my father's world, about my feeling of being an imposter in my own life. In return, she offered small, fragmented pieces of her own story. A childhood in a small town, a passion for the piano that had once been the center of her universe, a dream that had somehow faded along the way. She never spoke ill of my father, but the emptiness of her life with him was written between every line she spoke. I'd go up to bed each night, my mind electric, every nerve ending tingling. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was charged with potential, with the humming energy of our shared secrets. I was no longer seeing my father's wife. I was seeing Isabel. And I was beginning to realize, with a terrifying and exhilarating thrill, that she was finally, truly, seeing me too. The rain began on a Tuesday, a soft, apologetic drizzle that turned, by Wednesday, into a relentless gray sheet of water that blurred the edges of the world. The house, already a fortress of solitude, now felt like a submarine, sealed and submerged in a world of its own. The endless drumming of rain on the roof and the gurgling in the gutters became the house's new melancholic heartbeat. I was going stir-crazy, pacing the halls like a caged animal, the silence and the endless gray pressing in on me. It was in the middle of this restless wandering that I heard it. A sound so unexpected in this house of ghosts that I thought, at first, I was imagining it. Faint, haunting notes of a piano, weaving through the sound of the rain. I followed the music down the main hallway, past the formal dining room and my father's severe, imposing study, to a set of tall, closed doors I had never seen open. The living room. My father called it the reception room, a place for business associates he needed to impress, though I couldn't recall it ever being used. I pushed one of the doors open, and it groaned on its hinges, the sound of disuse. The room was vast and dim, most of the furniture shrouded in white dust cloths, looking like a congregation of silent, lumpy ghosts. In the center of the room, by the tall, rain-streaked windows, sat a black grand piano. Its lid was propped open, and its polished surface, unlike everything else in the room, was free of dust, though the air around it was thick with dancing motes. And there was Isabel. Her back was to me, her posture perfect, her shoulders moving with the emotion of the piece she was playing. The music was a torrent of feeling, a Chopin nocturne that I recognized vaguely, full of aching beauty and a deep, inconsolable longing. It was the sound of a heart breaking in the most beautiful way imaginable. I stood in the doorway, hidden in the shadows, and just listened. This wasn't the polite, composed woman I shared coffee with in the kitchen. This was someone else entirely. The music was her real voice, a raw, unfiltered confession that spoke of abandoned dreams and profound loneliness. She was pouring everything she couldn't say into the keys, and I felt like a voyeur, eavesdropping on the most intimate parts of her soul. She played the final, lingering notes, and they hung in the dusty, rain-filled air, vibrating with a sorrow so palpable it made my own chest ache. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, and I was about to retreat, to leave her to her private world, when she spoke without turning. "You can come in, Leo. I know you're there." My face flushed, caught. I stepped slowly into the room, my sneakers silent on the thick Persian rug. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sounding rough. "I didn't mean to intrude." She finally turned on the bench, and her face in the gloomy gray light was devastatingly beautiful. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears, and all her usual defenses were gone. She looked vulnerable, open. "You're not intruding," she said softly. It's been a long time since anyone listened. She patted the space beside her on the long leather bench. Come, sit with me. It wasn't a request. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me across the room. I sat down beside her, the old leather sighing under my weight. The proximity was jarring, electric. I was closer to her than I had ever been, close enough to see the tiny, almost invisible scar just above her eyebrow, close enough to smell the jasmine in her hair, now mingling with the nostalgic scent of old paper and wood. I was acutely, painfully aware of the warmth of her body, of her thigh just inches from my own. "Have you ever played?" she asked, her voice pulling me from my daze. I shook my head. My father tried to make me take lessons when I was 10. I think I lasted a month. A real smile touched her lips. A sad, knowing smile. It's not something you can force. Her eyes fell to my hands, which were resting awkwardly on my knees. "Let me show you something simple," she said, "just so you can feel it." Before I could protest, she took my right hand in hers. Her touch was a jolt, a low-voltage shock that shot straight up my arm and exploded in my chest. Her skin was warm, her fingers surprisingly strong as they wrapped around mine. She guided my hand to the keyboard, the ivory keys cool beneath my fingertips. "This is a C," she whispered, her voice close to my ear. Her breath was warm against my neck. She pressed my finger down. A single, clear note rang out. Then she gently positioned my other fingers. "Just relax your hand," she murmured, and then she did something that stopped my heart. She covered my hand entirely with her own, her palm pressing against the back of my knuckles, her fingers interlacing with mine, guiding me down. A simple, harmonious C major chord filled the room. But I barely heard the music. All I could feel was the layered warmth of her hand on mine, the intimate pressure of her skin, the universe of unspoken things contained in that single point of contact. And that's when the thought, the one I had been pushing away and denying for weeks, broke through the surface with the force of a tidal wave. I want her. It was clear and sharp and undeniable. It wasn't just an abstract attraction anymore. I wanted to turn on the bench, to put my hand on her neck, to taste the sadness on her lips. I looked at her, truly looked at her, not as my stepmother, but as the woman sitting beside me. I saw the graceful column of her neck, the faint pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. I saw her lips, full and perfectly shaped, parted slightly as she concentrated on our hands. The desire to lean in and kiss her was so powerful, so overwhelming, that I had to physically stop myself from moving. Hot, prickling guilt washed over me immediately, a sickening countercurrent. "This is Isabel. This is your father's wife. This is wrong, so wrong." The chord faded into silence, but she didn't let go of my hand. We sat there for an eternity, our hands clasped together on the keys, the air between us crackling with a dangerous new energy. We both knew. We both felt it. A boundary had not just been crossed, it had been incinerated. Finally, as if moving through water, she slowly withdrew her hand. The sudden cold where her warmth had been was a physical ache. "See?" she said, her voice barely a whisper, a little shaky. Simple. She wouldn't look at me. The spell was broken. I felt a desperate need to flee, to get away from the intensity in that room, from the truth of what I was feeling. I should go," I stammered, standing up so quickly I nearly stumbled. "I have to study." I escaped the room, my heart hammering against my ribs, leaving her alone with the dusty ghosts and the silent piano. The rain was still falling, but the real storm, the one that would change everything, was no longer outside. It was raging inside of me. The days that followed the piano lesson were a strange mix of excruciating tension and a bizarre, unspoken intimacy. We were like two magnets flipped the wrong way, desperately wanting to connect but constantly repelling each other out of fear. We avoided the formal living room as if it were radioactive. Our conversations in the kitchen became clipped and functional again, focused on groceries and whether the mail had arrived. But it was all a performance. Every time we passed in the hall, a current crackled in the air between us. I would catch her looking at me, her eyes full of a confused, questioning sadness, and I would have to look away, my own heart hammering with a cocktail of desire and guilt. We were orbiting a truth so dangerous that neither of us dared to speak its name. The reprieve and the final push over the edge came on Friday evening. The call came just as we were sitting down to another quiet dinner. The house phone, an archaic landline my father insisted on keeping, shrilled from the wall, making us both jump. Isabel answered, her voice slipping instantly into the smooth, placid tone of the perfect wife. "Richard, darling, how is Zurich?" I ate my food, pretending not to listen, but my ears strained to decipher her side of the conversation. There were long pauses, punctuated by her soft murmurs. "Oh, I see. No, of course I understand. Yes, the merger is the priority. An extra week, then?" My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. An extra week. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with possibility. "Don't worry about us," she said, and for the first time I heard the subtle irony lacing her tone. "We'll be perfectly fine. Be safe." She hung up the phone and stood with her back to me for a moment, her hand still resting on the receiver. When she turned around, her face was a mask of serene neutrality, but I could see a storm of emotions swirling in the depths of her eyes. Resignation, frustration, but also something else. A wild, reckless spark of something that looked like freedom. Later that night, the house was quieter than ever, as if it were holding its breath. I was in the den, trying to read, but the words on the page were just black squiggles. My mind was consumed with her. With the extra week, 7 more days, a lifetime. I heard her soft footsteps approach, and my pulse quickened. She stood in the doorway, not in her usual modest nightgown, but in dark jeans and a simple, fitted black sweater. She was holding a bottle of wine, its label a deep, intimidating crimson. It was a Chateau Margaux. A bottle I knew from my father's lectures was astronomically expensive, one he was saving for a major anniversary or a landmark deal. Isabel held it up, a wry, conspiratorial smile playing on her lips. "My husband has been saving this for a special occasion," she said, her voice a low purr. "I've decided that his continued absence and our shared survival of this crushing silence qualifies. Don't you agree?" It was a challenge, an invitation to be her co-conspirator. My guilt, my hesitation, it all evaporated in the face of that smile. "Absolutely," I said, closing my book. "I'll get the corkscrew." We sat at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp over the sink, which cast long shadows and made the room feel like our own private, secluded world. The pop of the cork was a gunshot in the stillness, a sound of rebellion. She poured the wine, a liquid so dark and rich it looked like melted rubies. I watched her, the way the dim light caught the curve of her cheek, the serious concentration in her eyes as she performed the ritual. We clinked our glasses together, the delicate crystal chime sealing our pact. The first sip was a revelation. It was complex and velvety, a taste of a world of luxury that felt illicit and decadent. For a while, we drank in a comfortable silence, the wine doing the talking for us, warming us from the inside out, slowly dismantling our defenses. With the second glass, she began to talk. Really talk. She spoke of her life before this one, of the fierce, all-consuming passion she had for the piano. She described her tiny apartment in the city, the grueling hours of practice, the thrill of performing, even for a small audience. "My hands," she said, looking down at them as if they belonged to someone else. "They used to be so strong, so sure of what they were meant to do." "Were you happy then?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. The question hung in the air. She took a slow sip of wine, her gaze distant. "Happy?" She repeated the word as if it were from a foreign language. "I was alive. Every part of me felt alive. I was poor, and I was always tired, but I was creating something. I was becoming someone." She finally looked at me, her eyes bright and intense. "Richard is a good man, Leo. He's generous. He's given me everything you see around you. This magnificent house, a wardrobe full of beautiful clothes, a life free of any material worries." She paused, swirling the dark red liquid in her glass. "He's given me everything, except the one thing I ever really wanted." "What was that?" I whispered. "To be seen," she said, the words heavy, with years of unspoken truth. for who I actually am, not for what I look like on his arm at a charity gala. I feel like I'm the most beautiful object in his collection, his prized possession. I'm the curator of this perfect silent museum, and my only job is to make sure nothing is ever out of place, especially me. Her voice was steady, but a single perfect tear escaped and traced a glistening path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "It's a beautiful cage," she whispered, looking around the kitchen. "A gilded cage. But it's still a cage." Hearing her lay her soul bare like that undid me. The last remnants of my 19-year-old awe and childish guilt were washed away by a powerful, surging wave of empathy. I didn't see my father's wife anymore. I saw a brilliant, passionate woman slowly suffocating in a life that didn't fit her. I saw a prisoner, and in that moment, I felt a fierce, primal urge to protect her, to be the one who could somehow set her free. The age gap, the taboo, it all seemed meaningless. I was no longer a boy with a crush. I felt like her equal, the only other person in her world who could see the bars of her cage. Without thinking, I reached across the small table and covered her hand with mine. She flinched for a second, then relaxed, turning her hand over to lace her fingers through mine. Her skin was soft, and her touch sent a fire racing up my arm. She stopped talking and just looked at me, her tear-filled eyes searching mine. And in that long, silent gaze, the emotional affair was consummated. A silent promise was made. "I see you." The wine, the rain, the sleeping house, it all swirled around us, creating a perfect, isolated bubble of time. We were two lonely souls who had finally, against all odds, found each other in the dark. And we both knew, without a single word being spoken, that nothing would ever be the same again. The last of the expensive wine was gone, but its warmth lingered, coiling in our stomachs and loosening the knots of our loneliness. Our hands were still clasped on the polished oak of the kitchen table, a silent anchor in the late-night stillness. The single lamp above the sink painted the room in strokes of shadow and soft golden light, making the world outside the windows disappear entirely. We were in our own bubble, a universe comprised of one table, two glasses, and a shared confession that had irrevocably altered the space between us. I watched her, really watched her. In the quiet aftermath of her vulnerability, I saw the faint exhaustion around her eyes, the tremor in her soft lips, the perfect porcelain mask of Mrs. Richard Sterling had been shattered, and the woman underneath was raw and real and devastatingly beautiful. I felt a profound shift inside me. The boy who had a secret, shameful crush was gone, and in his place was a man who felt a fierce, aching need to protect the fragile soul she had shown him. Finally, with a soft, shuddering sigh, she gently pulled her hand from mine. The loss of her touch was a physical pang. "It's late," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion and fatigue. I should go to bed." The words were an attempt to put things back in their proper place, to restore the order of their world. But we both knew it was too late. The box had been opened. As she pushed her chair back and stood, she swayed slightly, a combination of the wine and the emotional toll of the night. I was on my feet in an instant, my hand instinctively reaching out to steady her, my fingers closing around her upper arm. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp jolt that was entirely different from our chaste hand-holding. Through the soft cashmere of her sweater, I could feel the warmth of her skin, the delicate firmness of the muscle beneath. We both froze. It was a simple, supportive gesture, one that could be easily explained away, but in the supercharged atmosphere of that kitchen, it was a declaration. My thumb moved, a small, almost imperceptible caress against her arm. She looked up at me, her dark eyes wide and searching in the dim light. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. What happened next was a surrender. A slow, inevitable collapse of all the walls we had so carefully maintained. She leaned forward, her movements fluid and desperate, and pressed her face into my chest. Her forehead rested just below my collarbone, and her hands came up to tentatively grip my shirt. It was a hug of pure, unadulterated need, of gratitude, of a loneliness so profound it could only be expressed by the pressing of one body against another. My arms came around her automatically, pulling her closer. She was so slight, so fragile in my embrace. I could feel the sharp line of her spine, the gentle curve of her back. I buried my face in her hair, inhaling her scent, jasmine, wine, and something uniquely her, something clean and warm and intoxicating. I held her, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ear. It was meant to be a moment of comfort, a hug between two lost people who had found a moment of solace. But it lasted a breath too long. The nature of the embrace shifted, the atoms in the air rearranging themselves. The comfort began to smolder, transmuting into something else, something hotter and more dangerous. It was no longer a gesture of solace, it was an act of possession. She must have felt the change too. She stirred against me, pulling her head back to look up at my face, but she didn't step away. She stayed within the circle of my arms, her hands still resting on my chest. We were so close I could see the flecks of gold in her dark brown eyes, could feel the soft whisper of her breath against my chin. The entire world, the entire universe, contracted to the few inches of space that separated our faces. I saw it all in her eyes in that moment. The fear, the guilt, the transgression, but beneath it all, undeniable and clear, I saw permission. I saw a desire that mirrored my own. My gaze dropped to her lips. They were soft, slightly swollen from the wine, and they were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. That was all the signal I needed. Time seemed to slow down, to thicken like honey. I leaned in, my movements hesitant, giving her every chance to turn away, to stop me, to bring us back from the brink. She didn't move. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, a tentative, questioning brush. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of discovery. Her lips were even softer than I had imagined, and they tasted of sorrow and expensive red wine. For a single, heart-stopping second, she was still, and I felt a flash of panic, thinking I had made a terrible mistake. Then, I felt it. A tiny, shuddering sigh escaped her, and she leaned into me, her lips yielding against mine, kissing me back. It was a kiss of heartbreaking relief, of two people finding a harbor in a storm. It was hesitant and clumsy and utterly perfect. All the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up longing of the past weeks culminated in this single, shattering moment of contact. But as quickly as it began, it was over. We broke apart, a sudden, ragged gasp of air. The sound was like a gunshot, shattering the intimate spell we had woven. The full, crushing weight of reality came crashing down upon us. "What have we done?" the thought screamed in my mind. Isabel's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, with a look of pure, unadulterated shock, as if she couldn't believe what we had just done. I saw my own panic reflected in her gaze. The beautiful, fragile intimacy of the last few hours was instantly vaporized, replaced by the cold, hard reality of our situation. I had just kissed my father's wife, my stepmother. No words were spoken. There were no words for this. Any sound would have been a confession, an indictment. With a small, choked sob, Isabel turned and fled. She didn't look back. Her bare feet made a series of rapid, panicked sounds on the stone floor, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. I was left standing alone in the center of the kitchen, the dim light suddenly feeling accusatory and harsh. My lips were tingling, branded with the ghost of her kiss. My mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, the dizzying, incandescent thrill of that moment immediately followed by a tidal wave of shame and a terrifying, gut-wrenching fear. The rest of that night was sleepless, and the entire next day was a masterclass in avoidance. The house was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was thick and heavy, haunted by the memory of a forbidden touch, screaming with the consequences of a line we had not just crossed, but obliterated forever. The 24 hours after the kiss were the longest of my life. The silence in the house returned, but it was a new, monstrous breed. It was a living thing, thick with the memory of what we had done, breathing guilt and suffocating desire into every room. We were ghosts in our own home, masters of avoidance. I'd hear her footsteps in the hall and change my direction. I'd wait until I was sure she was in the garden before I dared to go to the kitchen for a drink. We caught a glimpse of each other once, at opposite ends of the long upstairs corridor. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. I saw the same panic and longing in her eyes that was clawing its way up my own throat. We both turned away at the same time, a silent, mutual retreat. But the memory of the kiss was a brand on my lips. The feel of her, the taste of wine and regret, it was a constant, looping playback in my mind, tormenting me. The tension was building, the pressure inside the house becoming immense. I felt like the air itself was becoming flammable, that a single spark would cause the entire place to combust. The spark came, as it had to, on the following night. The day had been oppressive and humid, the sky a milky, hazy white. As evening fell, the world outside the windows turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple and green. A storm was coming. The air grew heavy, static, and the house seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation. I was in my room, the door closed, trying to read a textbook, but the words were a meaningless jumble. Every distant rumble of thunder felt like it was originating in my own chest. A soft knock on my door made me jolt, my heart leaping into my throat. I knew it was her. I opened the door, and she stood there, a silhouette against the dim light of the hall. She was wearing a simple, dark blue silk robe, her hair undone and falling over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes huge and haunted. "We can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Leo, we cannot keep doing this." The silence. It's worse than anything. I couldn't speak, so I just nodded, stepping back to let her in. She walked into the center of my room and stood there, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. "It was a mistake," she said, the words sounding rehearsed and hollow. "The wine, the conversation." I was emotional. It didn't mean anything. Did it not? I asked, my voice coming out as a rough rasp. I closed the door, shutting out the rest of the house, enclosing us in our own charged space. Her eyes met mine, and the lie she was trying to tell crumbled to dust. "You know it did," I said softly. At that exact moment, the storm broke. A blinding flash of lightning bleached the room white for a second, followed by an immediate deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the house to its very foundations. Isabel flinched violently, a small, terrified cry escaping her lips. And in that instant, all the pretense, all the resistance, was obliterated. The chaos outside gave us permission for the chaos within. I crossed the room in 2 strides. I didn't plan it, my body just moved. I put my hands on her arms, and she didn't pull away. She leaned into my touch, her whole body trembling. "Isabel," I breathed her name, and it was both a prayer and a plea. "Don't," she whispered, a last futile attempt at resistance. "Please, we can't." But she was looking at my mouth as she said it, and her protest was lost as I lowered my head and kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation, no discovery. This was a kiss of confirmation, of desperation. It was hungry and deep, a raw acknowledgement of the desire that had been torturing us both. Her hands came up to my neck, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. Her initial weak protest melted into a low moan that was swallowed by my mouth. She kissed me back with a ferocity that matched my own, a wild, frantic energy that spoke of weeks of denial. The kiss was a fire that consumed us, and words became obsolete. Our hands were everywhere, urgent and clumsy. We stumbled backwards towards my bed, a chaotic dance of tangled limbs and desperate mouths. Her robe fell open, and my hands found the warm, bare skin of her back. She fumbled with the buttons of my shirt, her touch feverish. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and I saw her as she pushed the robe from her shoulders. It slid down her arms and pooled at her feet, leaving her in a simple, dark silk chemise. In the stark, momentary light, I could see the silhouette of her body, the gentle curve of her waist, the swell of her hips. My breath hitched. She was more beautiful than anything I had ever dared to imagine. We fell onto the bed together. I was on top of her, my hands exploring the shape of her, my lips tracing a path down her throat. "Leo," she gasped, her voice thick with a desire that erased all doubt. Slow down. Ah, please. But her body betrayed her words, her hips arching up to meet mine, her legs tangling with my own. The thin silk of her chemise was a frustrating barrier. I tugged at the delicate strap, and it came away in my hand. With a single, fluid motion, I pulled the garment down, exposing her breasts. They were perfect, full and round, pale as moonlight, crowned with dusky pink nipples that hardened under my gaze. I lowered my head, and she cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pleasure as my mouth closed over one peak. Her back arched, her fingers digging into my shoulders, not with resistance, but as an anchor in a tidal wave of sensation. The room was dark, the only light, the strobing, violent flashes from the storm outside. Each flash revealed us in a different tableau of illicit passion, a secret frozen in time. The sound of the rain lashing against the windows and the rolling thunder became the soundtrack to our desperate act, masking the sound of our ragged breathing, of my name whispered from her lips like a curse. I rid us of the last of our clothes, our bodies pressing together, skin against skin. The feeling was overwhelming, a sensory overload of warmth and softness, and the intoxicating scent of her. As I finally pushed into her, she let out a long, shuddering moan, her head thrown back, her eyes squeezed shut. "Oh God," she cried, her voice a mix of pain and pleasure, and utter surrender. "Leo." "Ah, yes. Right there, please." All her resistance was gone, replaced by a desperate, hungry need that met and matched my own. The storm outside raged, and the storm within us raged with it, a tempest of forbidden pleasure and searing guilt. It was a frantic, almost violent act of release, a culmination of everything that had been building between us. As a final, deafening crack of thunder shook the very frame of the house, our own storm broke, and we collapsed together, a tangled mess of sweat-slicked limbs, gasping for air in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. The passion receded like a tide, leaving us washed up on the shore of our transgression, our breathing slowly returning to normal as the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. We didn't speak, we just lay there in the darkness, and I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was absolute, that nothing for either of us would ever be the same again. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright and clean, the world washed new. But inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with the residue of our own tempest. I woke up alone in my bed, the sheets a tangled mess, the air still holding the ghost of her jasmine scent. The reality of what we had done settled upon me not with a crash, but with a slow, creeping dread. I had slept with my father's wife. The words felt alien, the statement of a stranger's life, yet the memory of her skin, of her voice whispering my name, was seared into my mind. I didn't know what to do, what to say, how to even look at her. I stayed in my room until I was starving, then crept downstairs, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm. She was in the kitchen, her back to me, making coffee. She was dressed, her hair was tied back, and she looked exactly as she always did, calm, elegant, composed. It was as if nothing had happened. She turned as I entered, and for a split second, our eyes met. In that fleeting glance, I saw everything, the memory of the night, the fear, the confusion, and a flicker of something so intensely intimate it was like a physical blow. Then, instantly, the mask of polite neutrality snapped back into place. "Good morning, Leo," she said, her voice perfectly even. "There's coffee if you'd like some." I mumbled a thanks and poured myself a cup, my hands shaking slightly. We moved around each other in the kitchen with a stilted, awkward choreography, our bodies hyper-aware of each other's proximity. We were two strangers again, but it was a lie, a performance for an audience of no one. We both knew that the people we were yesterday no longer existed. We had burned them down in the storm. In the days that followed, without ever discussing it, we created the rules for our new world, our secret life. By day, we were a tableau of domestic propriety. We were Isabel Sterling, the graceful lady of the house, and Leo, her collegiate stepson, home for the summer. We would exchange pleasantries in the hall, discuss the weather, or what to have for dinner. It was a fragile, carefully constructed charade. But the house had new acoustics now. Every sound was laden with meaning. The soft click of her bedroom door closing at night was no longer just a sound. It was a signal, a promise. The glances we stole were no longer just glances. They were entire conversations, filled with longing and anticipation. The daytime became a period of waiting, a long, slow-burning prelude to the night. And this shared, secret anticipation was a form of intimacy in itself. When darkness fell, the house transformed. The stage for our daytime play became our private sanctuary. The rules of the real world were suspended at the front door. Night was ours. Sometimes she would come to my room, a silent shadow slipping through the darkened hallway. Other times, I would go to hers, my heart beating a frantic rhythm with every step, terrified of making a sound. The first time I entered her bedroom, it felt like the ultimate transgression. It was so completely her. The soft colors, the scent of her perfume, the books stacked on her nightstand. It was nothing like the cold, masculine austerity of the rest of the house. It was her haven, and she was inviting me into it. Our lovemaking evolved from the desperate, almost violent urgency of the first night. Now, we had time. We had the long, quiet hours of the night to explore each other, to learn the rhythms and secrets of each other's bodies. We were unhurried, tender, and at times, utterly ravenous. We discovered a hunger in each other that had been starved for years. For her, it was a hunger to be touched with passion and not possession, to be seen as a desirable woman and not just a beautiful object. For me, it was a hunger to connect, to feel something real and profound in a life that had felt hollow and prescribed. The guilt was always there, a constant, humming undercurrent beneath the pleasure. It was the salt that made the sweetness more intense. Every kiss was a betrayal. Every touch was a rebellion. We were trespassing, and the thrill of getting away with it was a powerful aphrodisiac. Our affair was not confined to our bedrooms. It began to bleed into the rest of the house, an act of reclaiming the cold, sterile spaces and making them our own. One night, we made love on the thick Persian rug in the library, surrounded by thousands of leather-bound books my father had bought by the yard, but had never read. In the quiet, dusty room, our whispers and the soft sounds of our bodies felt like a sacrilege, a vibrant, living act in a place dedicated to dead words. Another night, in the formal living room, she played the piano for me, softly, her body bare in the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Afterwards, we came together on the floor, right beside the instrument of her lost dreams. We were imprinting our own secret history onto the architecture of my father's life, turning his museum into our home. But our secret world was a fragile bubble, and the fear of it bursting was a constant companion. The paranoia was a low-grade fever that never broke. Every unexpected sound, the crunch of gravel in the driveway from a passing car, the sudden ring of the telephone in the dead of night, would make our hearts seize. We would freeze, our bodies rigid, our eyes wide with panic in the dark, listening, waiting for the sound of a key in the lock. In those moments of shared terror, we would cling to each other, two children hiding from a monster. The fear was terrible, but it also bound us closer together, making our stolen time feel infinitely more precious. It wasn't just physical. In the quiet, languid hours after our passion was spent, we would lie tangled in the sheets and we would talk. She'd tell me about the girl she used to be, the one who believed music could save the world. I'd tell her about the man I was afraid of becoming a hollow copy of my father. We shared secrets that we had never spoken aloud to another living soul. She saw past the awkward college student and saw the potential in me. I saw past the trophy wife and saw the brilliant, captive woman inside. We were falling in love, a dangerous, impossible love born in silence and secrecy. For that 1 week, suspended in time by an extended business trip, we lived an entire lifetime. We created a perfect, secret world within the walls of that house. A world of stolen touches, whispered confessions, and a passion that felt realer than anything in the world outside. But we both knew. We knew it was a fantasy, a beautiful, temporary dream. And sooner or later, the owner of the house, the king of the castle, was due to come home. The end of my father's second week in Zurich was approaching, a fact that hung in the air between us, unspoken but ever present. Our secret world, which had begun to feel so real, so permanent, was built on the fragile foundation of his absence. A countdown had begun. This knowledge added a new, sharper edge to our affair, a quiet desperation to our stolen moments. The nights became more precious, the passion more profound, as if we were trying to store up enough warmth to last through a long, impending winter. We were no longer just exploring, we were memorizing each other, trying to commit every touch, every taste, every whispered word to memory. It was late on one of these nights. I was at the desk in my room, a single lamp casting a pool of golden light on the open pages of my anatomy textbook. I was staring at a detailed illustration of the human nervous system, all intricate pathways and complex connections, but my mind was elsewhere. I was tracing the pathways of our own affair, the unexpected turns and the dangerous synapses we had formed. My body was in the chair, but my soul was listening, waiting for the soft footfall in the hall that signaled the true beginning of the night. The knock came, so soft it was almost imaginary. I opened the door, and she was there. She wore a slip of a nightgown in a color like champagne, its silk shimmering in the dim light from my room. There was no pretense of distress, no hesitation. Her expression was calm, her eyes held a playful, knowing glint, and a slow, deliberate smile touched the corners of her lips. She was no longer a woman succumbing to a moment of weakness. She was a woman coming to her lover. She glided past me into the room, her scent that familiar, intoxicating jasmine filling the space. Her eyes fell on the open book on my desk. "Gray's Anatomy," she said, her voice a low, husky murmur. "A classic." "Having trouble?" "Always," I admitted, my voice thick. "It's like trying to memorize a map of a city you've never been to." She walked to the desk and leaned over my shoulder, ostensibly to look at the diagram. The gesture was pure, calculated seduction. The silk of her nightgown brushed against my arm, and a cascade of her dark hair fell forward, tickling my cheek. I stopped breathing. She traced the intricate illustration of the spinal cord with a single, elegant finger. "It's all about the connections," she whispered, her lips so close to my ear that I could feel the warmth of her breath. "How one small touch in one place can send a signal, an undeniable feeling, to somewhere else entirely. The human body is a remarkable instrument, isn't it, Leo?" The academic pretense was a thin, transparent veil over the raw desire in her voice. The lesson she was here to teach had nothing to do with textbooks. I turned slowly in my chair, my knee brushing against her thigh. I looked up at her. The playful smile was gone, replaced by a look of such open, hungry desire that it stole the air from my lungs. "Teach me," I whispered. That was all it took. She leaned down, and the kiss that followed was slow, deep, and utterly confident. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. It was a kiss that said, "I am yours, and you are mine, and tonight, nothing else in the world matters." When the kiss finally broke, she took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine, and led me away from the desk, away from the world of books and theories, and towards the bed. This time, there was no frantic haste, no desperate tearing of clothes. The storm had passed, and now was the time to explore the world it had revealed. She stood before me, and I slowly, reverently, slipped the silk straps of her nightgown from her shoulders. The garment pooled at her feet in a whisper of fabric, leaving her standing before me in the soft lamplight. I had seen her body in flashes of lightning, in the hurried darkness of our first encounter, but this was different. This was a revelation. I allowed my eyes to learn her, to study her anatomy with a devotion that bordered on worship. The elegant curve of her collarbone, the gentle slope of her shoulders, the soft swell of her stomach. My gaze fell upon her breasts. They were even more beautiful than I remembered, perfectly round and full, her skin like luminous alabaster. As I watched, her nipples hardened, turning from a soft rose to a deep, dusky pink, a silent, physiological response to my gaze. "Leo," she breathed, her voice shaky. It wasn't a protest, but an invitation. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and cupped one of her breasts, my thumb stroking gently over the peak. A sharp, shuddering gasp escaped her lips, and her eyes fluttered shut. This time, as we came together on the bed, she was the guide, the teacher. The initial shyness she'd had was gone, replaced by an astonishing, uninhibited confidence. She seemed to be rediscovering her own body through my touch, and she was determined to show me the way. Her hands would guide mine, her whispers directing my mouth. "Here," she would murmur, her voice a ragged sigh. "Touch me, right there." It was intoxicating. She was not a passive recipient of pleasure. She was an active, demanding participant. The woman who had felt invisible for so long was finally claiming her own desires, speaking them into existence. Our lovemaking was a slow, deliberate exploration that built into a searing, unbearable crescendo. Her soft instructions turned into urgent, breathless pleas. She would arch against me, her nails tracing patterns on my back, a silent language of need. "Deeper, Leo," she'd plead, her voice breaking. "Please, don't stop. More." My name became a refrain, a mantra on her lips, each utterance pushing us further, deeper into our shared transgression. She was teaching me her body, and I was a dedicated, ravenous student. I learned that a certain touch on the back of her knee made her shiver, that she loved the feeling of my teeth grazing her collarbone, that she would bite her lower lip to stifle a cry when the pleasure became too intense. The clinical diagrams in my textbook were a pale, lifeless imitation of the living, breathing, exquisitely sensitive map of her body that I was now exploring. The lesson reached its inevitable, explosive conclusion. We moved together with a perfect, desperate rhythm, our bodies finally in complete attunement. In the aftermath, we didn't pull away. We lay tangled together, our bodies slick and our breathing ragged. The guilt and fear were still there, somewhere in the shadows, but for now, they were held at bay by a profound, bone-deep intimacy. She rested her head on my chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns over my skin. I looked over at the desk, at the forgotten textbook, its pages illuminated by the lamplight. She had taught me more about anatomy in the last hour than I had learned in a semester. She had taught me about the geography of desire, the cartography of pleasure, and the beautiful, fragile, and terrifyingly complex connections of the human heart. The last few days of Richard's trip were the peak of our secret world. We had moved beyond the initial frantic discovery into a rhythm of deep, comfortable intimacy. We had become bold. The fear, which had once been a sharp, ever-present threat, had dulled into a distant background hum. We were so completely immersed in our bubble, in the universe we had created within the walls of the house, that the outside world, and its rightful owner, began to feel like a distant dream. We cooked dinners together, our bodies brushing past each other in the kitchen with a familiar, casual grace. We'd drink wine and talk for hours, not with the desperate confessional tone of the first time, but with the easy cadence of two people who genuinely loved to listen to each other. The house was no longer a cold, empty museum. It was our playground, our sanctuary, every room infused with the warmth of our shared secrets. The affair felt less like a transgression and more like the most natural, essential thing in the world. We were in love, and in our arrogant bliss, we started to believe we were immune to consequences. We started to get careless. The crack in our perfect foundation appeared on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. It came not with a bang, but with the shrill, jarring ring of the telephone. Isabel and I were in the sunroom, her head resting in my lap as I read to her from a book of poetry. It was a scene of such perfect, domestic tranquility that it felt like a scene from a movie, too perfect to be real. At the sound of the phone, we both froze. It was the first time it had rung in days. She untangled herself from me, her movements suddenly tense, and went to answer it in the kitchen. I stayed behind, the poetry book lying open and forgotten, my ears straining to hear. I watched her through the doorway, a slender figure bathed in afternoon light. Her posture, which had been so relaxed moments before, was now rigid. "Richard," she said, and her voice was a miracle of composure, instantly transforming from the soft tones of a lover to the smooth, pleasant melody of a wife. "Darling, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting you to call." I watched her face, a study in forced serenity. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, but I knew she was seeing my face, our morning together, the last 2 weeks of our lives, flashing before her. "Oh," she said, and her voice was a little too bright. That's wonderful. A whole day early. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the receiver. "Of course, it's not a problem at all. We can't wait to have you home." A pause. "I love you too." The click of the phone being hung up was the loudest sound I had ever heard. She stood with her back to me for a long moment, completely still. When she finally turned, her face was a pale, terrified mask. The beautiful, confident woman I had made love to just hours before was gone, replaced by a frightened stranger. "He's on a flight from Frankfurt," she said, her voice a dead, flat monotone. "His meeting's finished early. He lands tomorrow afternoon." Tomorrow. The word was a death sentence. Our infinite, timeless world suddenly had an expiration date, a ticking clock counting down the final 24 hours of our existence. In an instant, the house ceased to be our sanctuary and became what it had always been, my father's property, and we were the trespassers. Panic descended, cold and suffocating. We moved through the house with a frantic, paranoid energy, trying to erase the last 2 weeks, trying to scrub away the ghost of us. It was a desperate, impossible task. How do you erase a memory that has soaked into the very air? We stripped the sheets from my bed, and from her bed, the scent of our shared nights rising from the linen like an indictment. We washed every glass, every plate, checked every room for any sign of our intimacy. It was in the middle of this frenzy that the first real jolt of terror struck me. "My textbook," I whispered, my blood turning to ice. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. "The anatomy book. I left it in your room last night. On the nightstand." Her face went completely white. "My book. In their bedroom. On her side of the bed." It was a piece of evidence so glaring, so damning, that it felt like we had signed a confession. "We have to get it," she hissed, her voice a terrified whisper. We crept up the stairs like thieves, our hearts pounding in unison. The door to their master bedroom was ajar. Pushing it open felt like breaking into a tomb. The room was the one place in the house we had never touched, the one space that remained wholly his. The air was different in here, heavy with the scent of his cologne, a faint cedar and tobacco smell that was the essence of my father. It made me feel sick with guilt. There, on her nightstand, next to a small, elegant lamp and a silver picture frame holding a photo of her and my father on their wedding day, was my thick clinical anatomy textbook. It looked obscene, a glaring symbol of our betrayal, sitting right next to the smiling image of the man we had wronged. Isabel snatched it, her hands trembling, and shoved it into my arms. "Go," she whispered. "Get it out of here. Now." I fled, my own bedroom no longer feeling like a safe haven, but like the temporary holding cell of a criminal. The strain began to wear on us, eroding the beautiful thing we had built. Isabel became a bundle of raw nerves, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The easy grace that defined her was replaced by a brittle, frantic energy. She cleaned obsessively, polishing already gleaming surfaces, straightening cushions, as if by restoring the house to its pristine, untouched state, she could somehow turn back time. I watched her, and for the first time, I saw the true crushing weight of her reality. I was a visitor here. I could leave. She was the one who was trapped, the one who would have to lie and pretend and smile while sleeping next to the man she was deceiving. The love and passion in her eyes when she looked at me were now clouded by a film of sheer, unadulterated terror. And I had put it there. The guilt was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. I looked at the photos on the mantelpiece, my father holding me on his shoulders when I was a boy, the two of us fishing at the lake, and I felt like the lowest form of traitor. The man in those pictures, my father, was no longer an abstract concept, a distant, corporate entity. He was the man whose wife I had taken, whose trust I had shattered, whose home I had defiled. We met for the last time that night. There was no pretense of passion. It was a sorrowful, desperate coming together in the dark. We didn't make love. We clung to each other, seeking a final moment of comfort before the world ended. Her tears were silent and hot against my skin. Every touch was a farewell. The house that had been our kingdom now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, suffocating us with the magnitude of what we had done. The beautiful escape had become a prison of our own making. The next morning, we woke to a house that was perfectly clean, perfectly ordered, and utterly silent. All the evidence was gone. But the foundation of our world wasn't just cracked, it had been pulverized. We were no longer lovers in a secret paradise. We were co-conspirators, stripped of our illusions, waiting for the warden to walk through the front door. The sound of the key in the front door lock was the most violent sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of our world ending. Isabel and I were standing in the grand foyer, our smiles rehearsed, our bodies so rigid with tension we might as well have been carved from ice. The heavy oak door swung open, and my father walked in. He looked tired from his flight, but his presence was as overwhelming as ever, instantly filling the house, reclaiming it, shrinking our secret world down to nothing. "Richard," Isabel said, her voice, a pitch-perfect imitation of a happy, welcoming wife. She glided forward and kissed his cheek. "We weren't expecting you until later." "I caught an earlier connection," he said, dropping his briefcase with a heavy thud. His eyes, sharp and analytical, swept over her, then over to me. "Leo, good to see you." He shook my hand, his grip firm, his gaze lingering a fraction of a second too long. In that moment, I felt like a child again, a guilty child, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He was assessing us. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. He was a shark sensing blood in the water, and we were bleeding guilt from every pore. The first hour was a masterpiece of psychological torture. As he unpacked, he kept up a steady monologue about his trip, the inefficiencies of the Germans, the quality of the steel in the merger, the blandness of airline food. All the while, he would drop little conversational bombs, their detonations silent but devastating. "You two look like you've been getting along," he commented, not looking at us as he hung his suit jacket in the closet. The question was casual, but the implication was not. "Yes, it's been quiet," Isabel managed to say. "I'm sure it has been," he replied, and the way he said it made the word quiet sound like a synonym for guilty. He looked at Isabel, a slow, deliberate appraisal of her from head to toe. "You look different, darling," he said. "There's a bloom about you." I felt my stomach clench. He was noticing. He was noticing the subtle changes in her that I had seen, the vibrancy that our affair had brought to her, and he was cataloging it not as a husband happy for his wife, but as an investigator collecting evidence. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the three of us seated at that vast, polished expanse of mahogany that now felt like an executioner's block. Richard took his place at the head of the table. The king returned to his throne, surveying his kingdom. Isabel and I sat on opposite sides, the distance between us a yawning chasm. We didn't dare look at each other, but I was so acutely aware of her presence that the air around her seemed to shimmer. The meal was a silent, agonizing affair. The only sounds were the scrape of a knife, the clink of a fork against a plate, the soft glug of Richard pouring himself another glass of wine. The exquisite food, prepared by Isabel with nervous, trembling hands, tasted like ash in my mouth. My own hands felt clumsy, alien. I was terrified I would drop my fork, that the loud clatter would be a confession of my shattered nerves. Richard ate with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes missing nothing. He began his interrogation under the guise of catching up. "So, Leo," he said, pinning me with his gaze, "your mother and I spend a fortune on your education. Tell me, what important lessons have you learned this summer?" The question was a perfectly aimed arrow, and I felt it pierce me. I mumbled something about genetics, about my online course, the words feeling stupid and hollow. My mind was screaming. "I learned what your wife's skin feels like. I learned the sound she makes when she's happy. I learned how to betray you." He listened to my pathetic answer with a small, unreadable smile, then turned his attention to Isabel. "And you, my dear," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "It must have been dreadfully lonely here, all by yourself." He let the words hang in the air, the lie of it, the absolute glaring falsehood. Isabel's composure was a thing of wonder. "I managed to keep busy," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I did a lot of reading, and some gardening." "I can see that," he said, gesturing vaguely at the house. "Everything is in its perfect place." As always, the compliment felt like a slap. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew. He didn't have proof, but he had something more powerful, the unshakable certainty of an intelligent, observant man whose territory had been violated. He started telling a long, meandering story about a junior executive at his company who had been caught embezzling funds. "It's always the ones you trust the most," he said, his eyes fixed on me, cold and hard as granite, "the ones you welcome into your home. They smile to your face, they eat at your table, and all the while, they are stealing the very thing you value most." The subtext was a living, breathing monster at the table with us. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. I risked a glance at Isabel. Her face was ashen, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. She was staring at her plate as if her life depended on it. The breaking point was a small thing. My hand was shaking so badly that when I reached for my water glass, I knocked it over. The crystal goblet hit the table with a sharp crack and then toppled, sending ice and water spreading across the polished wood like a pool of blood. The sound was catastrophic in the silence. Isabel let out a small, strangled gasp. I froze, my hand hovering over the mess, my face burning with shame. Richard didn't move. He didn't yell or show any sign of anger. He simply watched the water soak into the expensive linen napkin, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. And he smiled. It was the coldest, cruelest smile I had ever seen. It was a smile of absolute victory. He had his confession. My clumsiness, my terror, Isabel's gasp, it was all the proof he needed. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of absolute silence. When it was over, Richard stood, carefully folding his napkin and placing it beside his plate. He walked around the table to Isabel and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was meant to look affectionate, but I saw his fingers tighten, a brief, possessive squeeze. It was a gesture of ownership, a warning. Then he turned his gaze to me. It was a long, cold, silent appraisal, and in it, I saw the complete and utter death of whatever love he had ever felt for me. The disappointment was so profound it was like a physical force. "Leo," he said, his voice calm and deadly, "I think you've had enough of a summer vacation. Your things will be packed in the morning. I've booked you a flight back to campus at noon. It's time you went back to school." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a banishment, an exile. He turned and walked out of the dining room without another word, leaving Isabel and me sitting at the table in the wreckage of our lives. The confrontation was over. There had been no shouting, no accusations, just a cold, quiet, and utterly devastating execution. Our secret wasn't out because we had spoken it. It was out because he had seen it in our eyes, in our fear, and we had been judged. There was no appeal. My father's verdict, delivered in the cold, quiet dining room, was final. The rest of the night passed in a state of surreal, silent shock. I went to my room and packed a suitcase, my movements stiff and robotic. Every object I touched, a book, a shirt, a photograph from my life before that summer, felt like an artifact from a dead civilization. The house was utterly silent, but it was a new, oppressive silence, the silence of a tomb. Isabel did not come to me. I did not go to her. Our secret world, once so vibrant and alive, had been snuffed out, leaving behind only the cold ashes of what we had done. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken words and the suffocating presence of my father. He worked from his study, the door pointedly left ajar. He was a sentinel, a warden ensuring his prisoner was properly exiled. Isabel was a ghost, a pale, silent figure moving through the downstairs rooms, her face a blank mask of composure. We did not speak. We couldn't. Any word, any touch, would be a confession, and we had already been judged and sentenced. When the taxi arrived, I dragged my suitcase to the foyer. My father emerged from his study, his face impassive. "Your flight information is on your phone," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "I've transferred you enough money for the semester. Don't call unless it's an emergency." It was a severing, a clinical amputation of a son. Just as I reached for the door, Isabel appeared at the entrance to the living room. Our eyes met across the vast, sunlit foyer. And in that final, silent gaze, we said everything. I saw her regret, her fear, her sorrow. I saw the ghost of the passionate, vibrant woman I had come to know, now locked away again behind the placid facade of Mrs. Sterling. In my own eyes, I hoped she saw my apology, my heartbreak, and a love that I would never be able to speak. Then my father cleared his throat, a sharp, proprietary sound, and the moment was broken. I turned and walked out the heavy oak door, leaving the house of my childhood for the last time. I did not look back. Years have passed. It's been almost a decade. I am a doctor now, a resident in a busy city hospital. I spend my days and nights studying the human body, its intricate systems, its weaknesses, its capacity for healing. I am clinical, precise, detached. I trace the pathways of nerves and the branching of arteries on charts. A world away from the summer, I learned a different kind of anatomy. That summer is not a memory I revisit fondly. It is a scar, a place deep inside me that still aches when the weather changes. It changed the very architecture of my heart, leaving me cautious, melancholic, and wary of the kind of passion that can burn a life to the ground. I have loved other women, but never with that same reckless, all-consuming fire. A part of me is afraid to. I heard about the divorce a few years ago, not from my father. Our relationship is a cool, distant formality now, but from a chatty aunt at a family wedding. "Such a shame about your father and Isabel," she'd said over a glass of champagne. "They seemed so perfect. She just left one day. He never talks about it." I nodded, my face a carefully constructed mask of mild interest, and changed the subject. I never learned the details. I never asked. I don't know if he ever confronted her, if the truth was ever spoken aloud between them, or if their marriage simply collapsed under the weight of a secret he could see every time he looked in her eyes. I sometimes wonder where she is. If she found her way back to a life with music in it, if she ever sits down at a piano and allows her fingers to speak the truth. I hope she did. I hope she found a way to be seen. Was it love? Or was it simply a collision of two desperately lonely people in the suffocating silence of that house? For a long time, the question haunted me. But now, I think the distinction doesn't matter. What we had was real. The connection, the passion, the brief, beautiful illusion that we could save each other. It was the most real thing in my life. And so was the fallout. That was the true lesson of that summer. It wasn't about biology or the clinical mechanics of the human body. It was about the messy, unpredictable, and often painful anatomy of the human heart. It was a lesson in how desire can be mistaken for love, how loneliness can be mistaken for a connection, and how a single, forbidden touch can create a wound that never truly heals. I saw her once more. It was 2 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in Boston. I was leaving the hospital after a long shift, my collar turned up against the wind. The streets were a blur of wet asphalt, bright taillights, and anonymous umbrellas. As I waited for the light to change, my eyes drifted across the street. And there she was. She was standing under the green awning of a flower shop, looking for a taxi. She was older, of course. There were fine lines around her eyes, and her hair was cut shorter. But it was her, the way she held herself. That familiar, elegant posture, mixed with a hint of melancholy. Our eyes met through the sheets of rain and the rush of traffic. The world seemed to fall away. For a long, silent moment, there was only the two of us, suspended in time, the 20 feet of rain-swept street between us feeling like an impassable ocean. Her eyes widened in recognition, and I saw a flicker of 100 different emotions pass over her face: shock, sadness, and something I couldn't name. I didn't smile. She didn't wave. We just stared, two survivors of a shipwreck that no one else knew had ever happened. Then, a taxi pulled up to the curb in front of her. The spell was broken. She gave me one last, long, searching look, a look that held a decade of unspoken words. And then she got in the car. It pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the rain, and she was gone. I stood there on the corner long after the light had changed, the cold rain mixing with something warm on my face, left with nothing but the ghost of a memory and a quiet, aching question that I know I will carry with me for the rest of my days.